Karthick, good to see you.
Great to see you, Richard.
Yeah. So Karthick and I have known each other for about 15 years. We've done a lot of panels together on politics and AAPIs in elections. So I know that we don't necessarily have a news peg today on that topic. I joke here as we're on a Thursday, but we are here to talk about something that is part of that conversation, aren't we? About how the different issues within society affect those who come from different backgrounds in industry, in the economy, and how that affects our perception. So we can kind of see it as two different places, and I'm going to throw it over to Karthick, in that we have what we do at work, and we have that which we do not at work. And not at work is, at least two big buckets. That's what we use our volunteer time or community time, and then on top of that, what we do at home. All of this relevant to the data that we do or do not have to understand the way that we function as one part of a very plural society. And so the question that we wanted to attack ostensibly tonight was that issue from his seat and my seat based on research that we've done for the last 3 years is, what is that bucket that's at work? And how can we understand it and move the discussion forward productively, not emotionally, and have clear desired outputs, and that you can talk to at the C level and at the board director level. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, along with Karthick. Karthick and API Data was one of the lead partners to get it done.
So I think I'll just add to that, Richard. I think I just reflected on this. In some ways, Richard, he's an entrepreneur. He's done so many different things, but you're known as a media person, right? That's the strongest part of your portfolio. And now you're moving more into research, which is like awesome. And my strength has been in research, but I've been moving more and more into narrative and at least media agenda setting. So it's kind of interesting to see us kind of meeting in the middle here.
When I've had him on air, I call him Dr. Data, and when I'm on air with him, he just calls me you. So no honorific coming my way. Huh? All right. So what we'll do is we're gonna. It's very important what we do in news is whenever we tease something or we give you a paragraph, and what we're going to talk about is we always say we're going to deliver on the promise. And today's discussion, when we look at Asian Americans at work and the 2024 election outcomes, the outcomes are definitely what we'll get into. And I'm guessing none of you have any thoughts or questions on that? All right, well, I am going to go to the audience right now very quickly so Karthick and I understand what you want to get out of today's conversation. How about you in front in the white coat? Yeah.
It's more beige.
Yeah, beige. I'm not so good with colors. What do you want to get out of today's conversation? On what? Oh, okay, awesome. That's great to hear. You wearing yellow. Last time you wore yellow. Fantastic. And right behind you with the glasses? The gentleman? You're looking at me?
I could say Asia population as a whole.
Okay, great. I'm going to swing way over here. I'm not sure how fast the mic.
By the way, Asia population in Asia, in America, or both? In America. Okay.
Okay, great. Anybody you want to go to, John? Just put the mic in front.
I'm allowed to do that.
All right, so I'll pick this gentleman with the purple shirt.
All right, so just meaning the election outcomes and what affects to Asian societies.
Okay, great. I'll get one more left, wearing a black top and glasses. Yeah, I know.
I think everybody's already said very much the same things that I'm looking forward to hearing tonight. But, obviously with the very recent election on all of our minds and to really understand more about how that might affect the Asian American population directly.
Okay, and then right behind you to the right. My right, sorry.
I just ended up here, so I'm just, yeah.
She came for the food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
great.
looking forward to hearing.
All right, great, thank you.
Yep.
All right, so that worked out really well. But thank you all. That's very helpful for us. We're going to have questions and answers at the very end. And if you really feel impassioned, do raise your hand, and we will engage with you as we go along. Please feel free to do that. Karthick and I are used to being very spirited and to challenge each other along the way. So we expect that also throughout this conversation. Inclusion at work was the idea that we can ask or should ask questions about work and at work that you cannot ask. A lot of companies were saying, we have our own internal study related to inclusion. But can you ask the questions that you really need to ask? And will you get real answers? Am I happy at work because of my background or the way I'm perceived? And my background was perceived at work. Have you ever considered a lawsuit? Would you answer that question if your boss was asking that on a survey? We understand. So that was the objective. We brought along a group of partners and sponsors. Karthick was the first person I called. We engaged in this very early on, 3 years ago, and have been crunching the data for about a year before we came out. The Asian American, or AANHPI release, it's 100 pages long. You have the executive summary with you. If you would like the full 100 pages, just, the QR code in the back, and we'll get that to you. Some of the reactions, these are all the reports. Silicon Valley, inclusion at work, API, Latino Americans, Black Americans, and then gender. Latino Americans was the last one we did that came out during Heritage Month, just this year. Some of the results that we found, going back to that question, have you ever considered a lawsuit based on the way that you've been treated because of your identity or background? In this room, who has felt that way? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so three or four have thought about it, talked about it. 1 in 3 is the answer for the API group. And what do you think? Is it higher or lower in this group, Karthick? Compared to
Well,
other
I mean,
groups?
that's an anonymous, self-administered survey, and it's hard for people in a public setting to, especially one with cameras.
Yeah, no, I understand.
You know.
No, I'm not talking about that. I mean, so across most groups,
Oh, you meant outside of API?
yeah, across most groups, it's fairly consistent.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you ask most of the groups that we had polled, when you talk to them in person, so there is a bit of the Bradley effect even on these polls that were done the way we administered them, which were not in person, that they would say, wasn't the number higher? Wasn't higher than 1 in 3? Again, this is a question that CEOs want to ask so they understand their risk and how they might mitigate that risk along the way. And it's important to try to understand that at the board level, and that API women are half as likely to consider that. When it comes to recruiting and retention, improving the racial climate at work, listen to this. This is like why do we invest in these topics or in these programs, whichever way they're administered through ERGs, BRGs, or what have you, is that the perception of API workers is that it's worth 11% as a pay raise. So when you're sitting at the board level, you're really considering, do I invest $1 in this and what do I get back? Well, guess what you get? You get perceived value of an 11% raise. Other effects, and this is important because I'm thinking as a director, guess what? If it is believed that the racial climate at work is not good, 56% of API workers say it's hurting revenue. It's hurting revenue. Again, what do you get out of investing in these conversations? And 44% of API men consider lawsuits because of, now that's higher, that's one of the highest groups of all of our polling across different ethnic backgrounds and on gender, that API men are more likely to consider a lawsuit than any other segment across what we polled along the way. So some of the action-based strategies that we worked on, and the difference in the research that we did, Karthick and myself and others that were involved in this, is we looked at what can you do. action-based strategies are so important to understand, okay, we've had enough of these very important questions being asked that CEOs want to ask but cannot ask. They cannot ask these questions that we just asked. And this is why we think it's productive and action-based. So if you make inclusion core to the work, guess what? API workers are 9 times more likely to say it's like a pay raise. 9 times more likely if you can actually create that environment. So another action-based strategy, plan the scenarios, then dig into the culture. And as I've been doing several discussions on stage with either chief legal officers or CXOs about how do you plan for what we don't know will happen on Tuesday in the last 2 months, my answer to that was, well, what I heard from the experts, if you were the practitioners, was first of all, do the scenarios, but absolutely dig into your culture. Like decide as a company what you are, what you want to be, and just stick to it. Because the political winds will come and go. And you have a company that you're part of and that you're running and that you're hoping to build together, and just decide what you are and get it done. Obviously, you have to do your scenario planning to understand how to react based on the outcomes.
Yeah, the only thing I'll jump in here, Richard, I think kind of legal issues.
Yes.
Especially legal threats.
Yes.
I mean, post affirmative action being overturned.
Yes.
In college settings. I think it seems to me that's had a bit of a chilling effect. Yes. But I think it's interesting here where it talks about dig into culture and values, because those can go beyond the law, right? And it's more about what kind of community are we?
Yeah.
So maybe certain things you can no longer do legally, or maybe you're being threatened with a different kind of lawsuit from the outside. But I think ideally there are different ways to express your core values.
You know what's interesting, Karthick, is that one of the panels was with chief legal officers that were sitting on the board. And this was their suggestion. Outside of, now the scenarios, which I can dig in, and I will, I'll give you a practical piece of advice that they gave us, but I'll keep on going. But you're absolutely right. You hit the nail right on the head. As simple as using inclusive language, 3 in 4 API workers say that increases productivity. So I know there's a lot of discussions where do the words count? They do. Do we overly focus on them? Yes, we do sometimes. But at least we need to be actionably looking at what are, like the one that I do not like using is you guys. Drives me nuts. I'll say it on air sometimes and I'll stop and I go, I mean, y'all. You ever do that? You say you guys, and I just want to be respectful of it. I'm not going to castigate you if you do that. I'm not going to say, oh, you just said you guys. I'm like, oh, it's horrible. I'm just like.
Yeah, but let me tell you of maybe oversteering the other way, all right? So for me, once I heard a few years ago someone said folks, and I was like, that's great.
Yeah.
So I'll just say folks, right? But then lately, some younger team members, they write FOLX, and I'm like, folks, as an FOLKS, there's nothing gendered about it. Like that is like human being. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you that language matters, but I think part of what we're seeing over the last few years, actually even among younger people, it's like, this has gone a little too far.
Yeah. And
a little too fancy.
On language.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing we're going to get, by the way, like I said, please raise your hand. I was talking about that with another business leader that is responsible for this kind of programming. And as the pendulum swings back and forth, there are always extremes are difficult, right?
Yep.
There'll always be difficult. And the job as, I think, a practitioner is to be like the Fed chair. And if you work for the Fed of either New York or San Francisco or have worked for the Fed and you desire to work for the Fed, know how to spell Fed. Okay, I'm just trying to get an affirmative from anybody, but the idea that you're watching the market, and in the inclusion space, the market changes, and the idea is you're trying to stay productive, right? At least that's my idea when we talk about inclusion or impact, is let's try to stay productive. And the Fed is trying to make sure what? that our economy remains productive. I must make, I didn't see what the notes were today, by the way. Anybody? Side point. But that's what they're doing, right? By changing their cadence, they're trying to make sure the economy in the United States writ large is healthy. And as I think inclusion and impact practitioners, you must do the same. You must be looking not at today, you must be looking at a year from now and 2 years from now, because we've seen.
Let me use another
extremes.
analogy that's like similar, Richard, if it's
Okay.
okay. You know, in addition to my API data work, for a couple of years, I ran this massive effort in California called California 100, right? And the 100 stands for 100 years and thinking ahead to the next 100 years. Turns out it's really hard to do. But part of it is about this practice called foresight, right? Which is to think in terms of scenarios and being resilient no matter what circumstance you find yourself in. And one analogy that we found helpful was, you know, when we're going through some massive transformations, not only politically, but societally, economically, technologically.
I didn't notice.
Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, people say that this is the fourth industrial revolution. Massive.
Or fifth or sixth, depending who you are.
Yeah. Massive shifts happening. So when you're in a world of deep uncertainty, as we're in right now, it's those core values as the kind of touchstones. Those are the things that keep you grounded, to know what to do. And I think what you're talking about here is inclusion is one of those core values that you hold on to. Now, how you express that might change depending on what the realities are,
right.
but you got to hold on to that stuff.
Yes. You've got to raise the rate and lower the rate. Don't keep at the same, you cannot use the same rate. You cannot. The market changes.
Going back to your analogy. All right, let's go.
I'm sorry. Yeah. And this is one of those action-based strategies. If you are in that space where you can talk to the chief legal officer or anybody at the C level regarding, okay, what do I do? Go out and hire an external counsel right now, and that external counsel should hire a crisis PR firm so that you can have the conversations you need to be productive. Some people might say, oh, that's a big defensive move. Some people might say that's a big offensive move. I tend to say, get what you need to get the right conversations done so that you can be productive in this space. So if you're at that level, because you brought up that point, is most often when you are dealing with these issues, this is kind of like, you know, your master's degree move, but this came from the chief legal officers. This is a great way to stay productive so that you are not always watching your P's and Q's necessarily, so that you can continue to talk about this topic. I thought this was a great best practice from inclusion practitioners along the way. ERGs and BRGs being intersectional is so important because a lot of those of you who participate in these in your businesses know that sometimes they just stay in their own corner. And it's most important if you're part of those ERGs or BRGs is to try to figure out, okay, we're going to do an event for this. Okay, what other two BRGs or ERGs can we bring in? Everybody familiar with business resource groups and employee resource groups? Distinction between the two? Anybody want to? You nodded, I think, who nodded yes? Now they're not going to nod yes. Did you nod yes? Okay, no. Did you?
Does anyone want to volunteer?
Yeah, anyone want to volunteer about like what the difference is, what they think it is? How about you in front?
At least perceived difference. How about
Yeah,
that?
perceived difference. Either one of these two.
So the employee resource group is where employees are coming together and working together to bring inclusion with events and other aspects of helping people to bring their best self to work. Whereas business resource groups are where the actual business key stakeholders within the organization are thinking of the impact to the organization, the bottom line, return on investment, etc. So the difference is they're both related to culture, but ultimately the employee resource group is where the ultimate culture is.
Exactly. And that is sometimes within our organizations, they really lose that distinction. Employee resource group tend to be for community, right? Create community. I focus a lot on caregiving resource groups right now, employee resource groups, because I want people to have community about caring for loved ones. Business is when you are looking at business outcomes, you're right. And often the leaders of these organizations are not compensated for the work they do. Now, that's a question and a debate within organizations about whether if you're leading this community within the broader business structure, should you get some compensation? That's one of the debates. I want to finish up on the study that we were here to present to you and some of the findings to be, again, very action-based. These are some of the things that we went through. Karthik, anything that stands out for you on this list of 10?
So to me, 7 is intriguing because I think of bystander intervention quite differently. So what does that look like in the business context?
Yeah, so in the business context, so I have a company called Priska, and it was started to look at the inclusion of the care economy and caregivers across the country and globally. Along the way, we were asked to do a PSA around bystander intervention, and we did it around a couple of business contexts. So whenever you might see a colleague and you notice, wait, that was maybe not right. Whether it's a statement being made that is talking about your gender and the stereotypes around it, how do I step in productively and say, okay, how do we get better at this?
So it's bystander training in a nonviolent context.
Yes.
Because we've heard a lot, right, post
That's correct.
hate crime increase in Asian American communities about violent contexts.
That's right. Right to Be, if you're interested in bystander intervention training, Right to Be does excellent training on this about how do you productively say, hey, let's get to a better place without it being, even in physical environments where you feel like you want to stand up. So that, I think, is good training, and a lot of businesses, Fortune 500 on down, have brought in Right to Be to do this training. And I'll tell you, you'll look at some of the things they'll teach you and go, wow, I would have never thought about that.
So I'll go to number 9 because I think that can be a good segue to my side, which is striving for excellence in each inclusion area. So like you want KPIs on this stuff.
Yeah.
You actually want people to track, do the interventions, and see if you're actually moving the needle.
Yeah, I was surprised that when I was not necessarily discussing this space the way this space is, was at CNN. This is 15 years ago, and they asked me to do a program for CNN in the community, and it was about supplier diversity, and they had KPIs related to that. It's like, what is supplier diversity? I have no idea what that is. So how do you bring it into your DNA where it's appropriate for your DNA as a business? One does not necessarily fit another, and that's where I think the discussions sometimes get in trouble. What were you thinking?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think things, I find like it's my observation with ERGs and also like diversity and inclusion work, it feels like a nice to have. And even if with BRGs, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to just be hard-nosed about it and think about the kind of strategic effect. Here's some, I think they're hard numbers, but also provocative numbers, right, in terms of what is the equivalent. And I remember, Richard, when you and I were talking about this, like,
Yep.
Okay, I'm getting a little uncomfortable. You're talking about what is the monetary value that you would put to this and
Yes.
asking an employee that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we should be rigorous.
Yeah.
This can't just be like a nice thing to have that is like not part of your bottom line.
Yeah.
But it's often treated that way. It's treated like a nice to have. You're not really being rigorous and measuring it, and you're not insisting on what progress looks like.
You know, one of the things that you're bringing up that is very relevant that I'm thinking about is, do we change? Because the question is, what's the language? And I'm starting to begin the conversation with David Morgan over at MMCA about, as you've seen the language change over the last 10 years in this space, in business, do we look at rubrics and metrics around impact? Because the question is, oh, I see you and you look like that. Did you earn it? Were you just hired because of this? And so do we need to change that impact, that conversation around, wait, what does an employee's impact on the business have? And that's the right way to really approach it. Now, I don't know what the sub-questions are around that at all, because we haven't gone to the next level. But I think it's an interesting notion. You know, I was, for better part of an argument, an affirmative action hire, at least by what you look at in the MOU that was written between Comcast and NBC Universal. I don't know the answer to that, but I think I was. That's for a different discussion. I'm glad I have my job, and I've been working really, really hard. I've got great bosses and great leaders, but I bring up that conversation about looking this way because I never thought it mattered, you know, that, but evidently, and obviously, we have to keep that part of the conversation. So that's that. And we want to also, so Karthick was part of all this research. He was my mentor along the way as we've worked together so long.
Wow, I've never heard you call me a mentor. This is...
yeah. So I'm giving him all these honorifics, and he, by the way, is still calling me you. But here you go, because this is also a very interesting part of our conversation today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say a little bit about API data. First of all, you know, it's always humbling, and I'm okay to be humbled. How many people here have heard about API data before? Okay, we need to do better work in terms of making sure, well, by the end of this evening, you'll know what API data is. So there are different ways to think about API data. In the news, sometimes we're called a firm, sometimes we're called a project, sometimes we're called a nonprofit. But really, API data is, you can think about it as a kind of virtual think tank of sorts. We produce data, but we go beyond data. And in fact, our tagline is based on a framework that I developed many years ago called DNA, which is quite simply data, narrative, action. And we did this with nonprofit leader training. You can use it in so many different contexts. Because we know that decision makers, if they're going to move resources, if they're going to change policy, they're going to have to see evidence. And usually they call that data. They want to see the data before they're going to do something different. So you need data for credibility, right? So we talked about this with a lot of leaders. You need data for credibility.
And to that point, the reason why I would have Karthick on air very early on is because you have narratives, you have these big 100,000-foot conversations. Okay, but what's the data behind that, right?
Yep.
And so if it was the API...
Because without data, he says data, by the way, and I say data. But without data, then it's just anecdote. It's just anecdotal impressionistic evidence.
Exactly.
Right?
And so if you have a question about the API community, just about on anything, it's API data.
So that's, you know, that's kind of, it's like, that's how it started. But where we are now is we also do narrative work and, you know, we do some action work. But essentially, well, you know, if you boil it down, you need data for credibility. But data in and of itself is not meaningful and it's not memorable. This is where the community narratives come in. This is where historical knowledge comes in. Anyone can generate data, but if you're going to try to interpret it in an effective manner, in a responsible manner, you need to have narrative in the deep sense, not just the thin sense. And some of this is based on scholarship I've done. I've written a book called Framing Immigrants. A few years old now, but the findings are still solid.
You've written more books than I want to ever read on our community.
Yes, I've written 7 books.
Yeah.
And then finally, so you need data to be credible, you need narrative to be meaningful and memorable, and you need action to be impactful, right? So you can generate all sorts of strategies based on data and narrative, but if you don't have a burning action in mind, then it's a dissertation, right? It's an academic enterprise. It's something that's to marvel at, but it's not really making a difference. So that's DNA.
He's talking about my reporting.
And you can learn more about DNA. You know, it's actually part of our logo. You know, it's not quite the hidden arrow the way the FedEx logo is, but data are those data points, right? That's the dots. Narrative is connecting the dots, and then action is that arrow. My mom is a quilter, by the way, and so even though I'm like, what is it? Even though it's not really true anymore, left brain and right brain, I suppose, right? So I certainly have the analytic side to me, but also the creative side from time to time, and to be able to pull that together. These are our key streams of work: original surveys, reports, data tools. We really want to make data more legible and accessible to community. And we know that we draw our strength from community partnerships. So often you have research institutions and think tanks that think of independence as their strength. We think of interdependence as our strength. That we don't think we lose anything in terms of doing really good, solid, evidence-based work by being this ivory tower and separated from the people that we work with. And so our people are community organizations, policymakers, and people in the media, right? We treat them as partners in the work. In fact, API data started, I don't know if you know this story, Richard, 11 years ago. It was after, was it 11 years ago? Yes, it was right after the 2012 election. What we saw, I had run 2 major national surveys, 2008 and 2012, and we would see a lot of media interest before the election, and then it would crash.
That sounds like us.
Right. People don't care about our community anymore, right? They're like, oh, okay,
No.
we know who the winner is.
No.
But in 2012, partly because the Pew Research Center, somewhat controversially, put out a report with some model minority framing, but given the amount of influence Pew has in the media landscape, a lot more reporters who are not Asian or Pacific Islanders started being more interested in our communities. And it was an Economist reporter after the election who called me wanting to know more about the Vietnamese community in Orange County. And he wanted some data. And I was like, okay, here's the Census Bureau website, just do it. And he's like, yeah, that's cute. Can you please do that for me? And then we can talk tomorrow once you send me the numbers. And it was great. And that was a light bulb in my head. It's like, oh, journalists are on deadline. They're very busy. They try to do the right thing. But if you don't have that opportunity to educate the person, it could be disastrous, right? And so that's why we brought, that's why I started API data, and that's why narrative work is an important part of it. I'll just quickly go through, right? So it's our DNA framework. One of the questions people ask about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, especially in the nonprofit space, is why do we obsess over data? And this is no joke and no lie. Like May 1st this year, we were on Capitol Hill with our demand, data disaggregation now. Like that was our demand.
What was it called again?
Data disaggregation now.
Oh, okay. That was the campaign?
That was the theme, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Judy Chu, who's the head of the Congressional API Caucus, she laughed. She's like, wow, like that's your fighting slogan, you know? For other communities, it's like housing, affordable housing now, or healthcare now. We're like, data. We want that data. So it sounds kind of insane. And by the way, that's us in the White House. If you've seen Veep, you know, that's in the Eisenhower building next to the White House with the marble, black and white marble flooring. That's us meeting with the Office of Management and Budget that just updated SPD 15. How many people here know what SPD 15 is? Okay, so this is about...
Thank you all for being honest. I appreciate that, because what is it? What is it?
So SPD 15 is Statistical Policy Directive 15, which again is like, why is that important? It sets the standard for all race and ethnicity data collections in all federal agencies, including EEOC, including housing, right? Including CFPB, everywhere. And because of that power, it will influence the forms that anyone here will be filling out starting the next 2 to 3 years. So there are 2 major changes that they made. One is to combine Hispanic into the race category. The other is to add the Middle Eastern and North African category. But the second major change was to mandate that the federal government disaggregate data by ethnicity for all racial groups. So it's not just about the Asian checkbox anymore. You will start having checkboxes for Chinese, for Filipino, and the like. Huge. But that mandate has a major escape clause. If a federal agency says that it's too burdensome, they don't have to do it. So that's why we're meeting with the federal government, to try to narrow the scope of those exemptions, right? And so we're paying a lot of attention. So why do our communities obsess about data? Because we know that without data, we have no standing. Our claims will not be heard, right? So we see that data is critical to ensure...
It's narrative only.
Yeah.
It's narrative only.
Yeah, anecdote.
Yeah.
I can understand your sob story, but I don't know what to do with it.
Or you're just one person.
Yeah. So data is critical to ensure that our communities are recognized, respected, and prioritized. That recognition, think of that depth of that concept, right? And I'll say, I've had different roles. For 6 years, I chaired the California Commission on API Affairs. One of the bills we passed was to disaggregate data in public health departments across California. This was passed in 2016. We said that California departments should follow the U.S. Census Bureau standard in terms of the categories that it would use for Asian and Pacific Islander populations. There's someone there from the Mien community who came and said, no, that's not good enough because our community is not listed.
What is the Mien community?
It's a Southeast Asian community. It's like
Origin geography?
Cambodia, Laos area, right? And so he said that, yeah, if you use a federal standard, that we don't exist in the federal standard. And at the time, and I feel some regret, I was like, you know what? Let's at least try to get this, right? Because the Census Bureau is the kind of arbiter of whether you, quote unquote, exist or not. So quite in a deep way, communities do not have standing to make legal claims and resource claims if they do not exist in the data. But finally, thank goodness, the Mien community and other communities activated and mobilized, so you have dozens of groups now. There are smaller groups, but they are now counted by the U.S. Census Bureau. You can go to our census data tool, and you can find out the number of Mien in different parts of the country, and there are many of them in the Central Valley in California.
Yeah, Southern California for sure. Well, I mean, quick question to all of you that are here today. Do you know how many origin countries fit into the term Asian or AANHPI? And just shout it out. You don't need to raise your hand. Any guesses how many origin countries it includes? How many? 47. On this side? Anybody? Just the camera's not on you. It's okay.
But I don't know about, see, I don't know about origin.
One more number. Just somebody, please. 40. All right, thank you. Well, the UN says, last I checked, 54.
But those are countries, right? So
that's
and
correct.
later on we can talk about what does it
that.
mean to be Asian, which is a racial category.
But I understand. But
Yeah.
and I knew you were going to go there. But let me do this first. And that's just to say, if we just look at the countries, the origin countries, in our slice of pizza in the United States, because it's been said this is one group. That's like we're one of 20 slices of pizza. Then you cut that one slice of pizza into like 50 little pizzas.
Yeah.
Like that's the reality of the.
Yeah.
The
And some
point.
people, you know,
And that's just origin country, because there's others that you just, I mean, because you were talking about the Mien community, which is not a geographic
right. You have some of these
borders.
transnational groups.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, right? Some people say, in fact, AB 724, how many people know Rob Bonta? He's the highest kind of Filipino elected official in the U.S. At least, well, there's a member of Congress, but he's the Attorney General of California. He might be governor of California someday. But he passed AB 724, which is trying to disaggregate data in the education context. Jerry Brown, the governor, vetoed it. And in his veto message, he said, why are you trying to divide the community? I thought you all wanted to be one and increase political power. And that's the fundamental contradiction, right? Are we one group, API or Asian? Are we two groups, Asian and NHPI, two different racial groups? Or are we many groups? And I think the answer is it depends on what you're asking. Right? And we shouldn't be sacrificed to ignore our differences for the sake of unity, because there is a lot. And this is why I do public opinion research. You need to collect the detailed data to then know, looking at the evidence, what are the circumstances under which you can talk about this as one group, and what are the circumstances under which you talk about these as many different groups. You need data. We try to democratize data, so check out our Community Data Explorer. Feed your curiosity. You know, in terms of, it's not just population counts, but you can look at homeownership rates. You can look at poverty rates. You can look at even nativity. I was surprised looking at this data. You know, I try to be as up to speed about our community, but our community is fast growing and it's fast changing. So if you look at New Jersey, right, if you look at the top 6 Asian groups, and if I asked you, which group is the most immigrant? Richard, if I asked you, which group in New Jersey is the most heavily foreign-born? What would you think?
Of the AAPI community?
Yeah.
Absolute numbers or by percentage?
By proportion.
Okay, by percentage.
Within the group. It's like what percentage of Chinese, what percentage of Filipinos, what percentage of Indians?
Oh, man,
Just go.
South Asian.
Indian, say, okay?
Yeah,
Asian Indian, right?
Yeah.
Turns out that it's Japanese, which is wild. We think of the Japanese American population as the most native born, but in New Jersey, it's not. So then I talked to someone in New Jersey. It's like, hey, can you help me understand what's going on here? Is this a fluke? Because these are not small sample sizes. they're like, well, yeah, there are a lot of Japanese immigrants now working in New York, and they've moved to Jersey for more affordable housing. It's like, okay.
Yep.
Right? So sometimes then data itself can then provoke you to think about what is the story there, especially when it's surprising, right? Counterintuitive. I'm really proud of the work we do now, not only taking government data, making it more accessible, but we do original survey data collections. So remember I said I'd done a survey in 2008. This is the first national Asian American survey. Did it in 2012. We were in the habit of doing it every 4 years during presidential years. And then with API Vote, we started doing it every 2 years starting in 2014. Now we're doing a survey every 2 months. And I'm so proud of that. Because without our survey data, you literally would not know where Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders stand on issues like abortion in real time compared to other groups, or on the environment, or on education. So we have all that data. And I'll end with an important part of the conversation. People want to know, like, what's the post-election agenda? Immigration, I mean, in addition to demographic work and survey work, I have expertise in immigration policy. And it's been remarkable, and from my perspective, not in a good way, about how the immigration debate has gotten so narrow and so divorced from the reality of what we know is the net long-term fiscal impact of immigrants to American society. But we had an opportunity here to get people to start thinking about legal immigration and not just undocumented or illegal immigration. And that's something that's going to be potentially on the chopping block with this next administration. Right? What we saw in 2017, I believe it's 2016, 2017, Senator Tom Cotton introduced a bill to try to reduce legal immigration into the United States. And that's something that we will likely see revived, to cut down on family visas, for example, which is still very important to Asian American communities. People think we're only here on employment-based visas. Half of Asian Americans who have green cards are here because of family, right? And then employment is the next big thing. So I think this is something that we need to be paying attention to, and certainly affects what happens at work. A lot of the discrimination that Asian Americans face is either because of their accent, their immigrant status, or their perceived foreigner status. So this is going to be really important, I believe, looking ahead in terms of an inclusion agenda with the next administration.
Thank you, Karthik. That was the second part of our three buckets that we're going to discuss today, right?
Yep.
And you were part of both of those. I appreciate the work you do. A lot of the stories that we're able to pitch and actually get on TV, as well as into newspapers, as well as online, is because of API Data's work. When we pitch a story, we have the anecdote, we have the family, but then what's the bigger picture? So the work is so important as from a journalist's perspective, and I thank you for that. The third part of our conversation today is the ballot. That's the core. It's beyond the ballot, but now we're going to go back to the ballot and the election outcomes. And we'll get two quick responses from ourselves, and then we'd like to put it out to you to ask anything you'd like on those three buckets of conversation today. First of all, what's your thought?
Well, we did a rapid response briefing, community briefing yesterday. We announced it on Tuesday. 200 people signed up, 140 people showed up yesterday. It was pretty remarkable. We had a webinar trying to make sense of the data. And the exit poll data that NBC, CNN, and others use, it's good, it's important, it's limited in terms of how representative it is on our communities. But even given that, top headline, I would say, is if you compare the exit poll data over the years, Asian Americans swung so dramatically, right, between 1992, right, voting for George H.W. Bush, 2012, 73% voting for Obama, and then now we're at 54%. It's been a steady decline since 2012.
54% for the Democrat.
Sorry, voting for Harris, right. So it's, if you look at a chart, in fact, if you go to our website, if you go to our action button, you'll see this, our event, and you'll see the slide deck. But first of all, that I've written a piece on like what accounted for that massive shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. It's now people are talking about Hispanic men and that swing in one election, but this was over 2 decades, but it was pretty remarkable. But then the question is, what's happened since 2012 that it's declining? And I think part of it is Donald Trump, right? And the way that he has been able to shape our perception of economic performance.
His understanding of the pulse of America is hard to question, given that the data was not necessarily being reported on, if it was even there, about the groups within these segments in the electorate. And certainly the reporting on these segments of the electorate, this is one journalist's perspective, we did not have the same dig deep into these different segments as we had in the past. I don't know the reason why, whether the data was, but I'm just watching all the way we were writ large, I'm not talking about my house, I'm talking about writ large, is that we didn't necessarily look at those groups. And when I would sit on these panels pre-election, the question was always, where's it going to go? Will the polls get it right? Right? And I said, well, by all indications, since 16, the pollsters have really dug down and tried to understand how to get it better. I think this round, and we'll find out after we get all of the exit poll data, the census data.
Yeah, we've gotten the first draft.
Right.
I mean, it'll take us 6 months to get all the pieces of evidence.
That will really tell us where the pollsters may have missed it. On the narrative side, what were we missing as a result, therefore? Because I think there were I don't think there necessarily was surprises about who won overall. It is the story I really think is how it was won and how it was lost. That, I think, is the surprise, if there were to be surprise in this post-election analysis. When people ask me, I say, well, it was within the margin of error, because overall.
Yeah, one story that I think will almost certainly emerge, like turnout data won't be out for, people are still counting ballots in many states, right, like in California. But I think one of the underappreciated stories still, it seems, of the 2016 election is that Trump expanded the electorate. And he did it again this year. So there's a lot of talk about how many people did he move over. Moving people over is really hard.
It is, yeah.
Especially with partisanship.
But not in the AAPI community.
Yeah, AAPI community is more persuadable. That's true.
Very persuadable.
But it's about these new voters, and especially, and it's not just hindsight and I told you so thinking. I remember even in the debate, during the dogs and the cats comment, right? And people are like, that's it, he's done. I was like, I think he knows what he's doing. People are looking at Laura Loomer, right? Hanging out with him more. And it's like, what is this very fringe, someone who's too fringe, even for Marjorie Taylor Greene, what is she doing there? And what she was doing there is expand the electorate. We might not like it. Those audiences may be people that we do not want to hang out with, but they are American citizens.
But we have to be careful. It's not expanding the electorate because we are all the electorate.
It's the voters.
It's expanding those who are voting.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I get asked this when I'm generally not in the United States and asked about the election, is why is it like this? I don't get. It's just what's happening with the United States. And I have not looked at the data below it, but certainly having lived in the South and lived in the Midwest, I understand, and for those of you who have lived there as well, you understand why there are certain perspectives, given even me being from California, and I look at New York, or living when I was at CNN in Georgia, and I would go, why are we covering this Northeastern story when this story in Texas is gargantuan? And I think that, what the country is learning is to become a country that crosses all of our state borders. And this is another election where we haven't quite figured out the secret sauce. And within that narrative is the sub-narrative of within every group. And I think the other part, which I know that you do a lot of research on, this is the big part of what you just spent time discussing, is a block of voters is not a block of voters. So whenever you're watching or whenever you're reading and you see, well, it's because of this group and that group, no. It is because of probably, if you divide it up into 5, that group, it's probably 2/5 or two parts of that made this go that way. And it was fairly flabbergasting that we weren't more complex this cycle about how to understand those nuances. Because this is not like after 16 when it woke up all of us as political consumers, that why didn't we, as part of the consumer class as well as the production class, why we didn't address that. Okay, let's get to some questions though. Let's keep John.
It was on so many of your minds, so you must have things.
Or reactions. You don't have to ask a question. You just tell you don't like Karthick's tie.
So Karthik, this is a question for you. You say data, you say data, I say data.
Yeah.
So, of course, you're using your data to analyze, promote, and help people to understand the AAPI population, remove the stigma. Data can have the, of course, unintended impact of also being polarizing, where we're comparing different populations, and it can really have this unintended impact of increasing racism and polarization between groups. And someone who comes from a very global background, that's one of the toughest things I've found is this polarization. Mm-hmm. So how do you use your data to bring inclusion, remove these boxes that we all put each other in, to say we are all the same, inclusion is for all? Just wondering how you use your data for that purpose.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think you and I might disagree, but in a respectful and productive way, because, of course, fundamentally we're all the same, but where you start has a significant bearing on where you are now, right? So that, and maybe we won't disagree. I see you nodding yes, so maybe we won't disagree after all. What I would say is that data and evidence is precisely that. It depends on how thin or how rich it is, and we always want to get richer sets of data. But ultimately, if you look back at our D now is no longer just data, but it's about insights. Like that's really what we're trying to get towards, right? You want to know what are the processes that are producing those patterns. So that's where then, when it comes to survey data, when it comes to demographic data, that's like your first kind of blush. But you shouldn't stop there. You have to start there so that you don't have a skewed understanding of a community, right? So ideally, representative data will help you fix your understanding of, is this group 50-50? Is it 80-20? Is it 40-60? What's going on, right? But once you get that, you got to start drilling deeper into the data. And then ultimately, I'm a big fan of mixed method research, right? So you have quantitative data, right?
I'm joking. That's your opinion.
No, but so you need to, not to nerd out too much, right?
Oh,
But if you're trying to understand causality, right? You have all these economists come up with this like really neat, randomized designs, et cetera. That'll get you a causal effect. If you're trying to understand the causal story, what is producing this, then you need to do interviews. You need to understand who are the people behind the data. So that's one way to think about data. Think about data as people. And yes, it's good to, what quantitative methods do is they simplify complexity, and that's really important to get this kind of first blush understanding. But then you need to start getting into the complexity again.
I know you weren't asking me, so I want to pipe in on this quickly, is that I think it depends on the starting point. And I know in my gender equity work over the last 15 years, the assumption is that women and girls are worth less than one. So that's the starting point. So therefore, I have to get the data to say, no, they're not worth less than one.
Say more about worth. What does worth mean?
It's the perception. You don't deserve the job. You can do that job, but the sun doesn't do that job. And this is a global, local issue that we all understand quite well. And by focusing on the difference is the way you can find the sameness narratively. But it depends on the starting point. And that is why I focus on the difference, but we all understand it's all about sameness, but your starting point is less than one, then I do have to bring out the difference so that we can see the sameness.
Yeah,
because right now it's not being seen.
Yeah, another quick thing.
Less than one.
Yeah, another quick thing I'll say, and I don't know if you were going to go there, but in France, they don't collect data on race because they think by collecting data, you will then create these categories that take on a life of their own. Well, France has race problems. They don't have the data, so they don't know what the solution should be. Right? So it's very rare for data to itself create categories. Plenty of political science research which shows that policies can create constituencies. Social Security helped create seniors as a powerful political class in America once you created Social Security. So yes, policies can create interest groups. Data will not create interest groups. Look at the Mien population. They existed and they were like trying to get anyone to pay attention to them. But because they did not have a label attached, they did not exist in the data. So I think that's far more the story in America, where people are being discriminated against, they're being marginalized, they're not being, and they're not being served. And data helps furnish that kind of foot in the door to then have that more credible conversation.
Do two at once, John. We'll react to both.
Thank you. Thank you for the data. I'm actually looking forward to diving into the breadth.
100 pages?
The 100 pages. I'm just struck by this quote by the Wall Street Journal, where it says diversity goals are disappearing from companies' annual reports. I actually have a two-pronged question. Why is that? And number two, how are, based on your data, Asian Americans doing at work?
Thank you. So the first two parts of the conversation, inclusion at work, as well as the work you're doing on data, very engaging. But personally, I came here with the hope of listening to beyond the ballot discussion, which I think was dedicated the least amount of time. So two questions that I think of. What does the outcome and beyond the ballot mean for Asians at work? And are there any actionable insights we can walk away from here, how to react to that?
To the first question, and thank you for keying in on that. I ask that question all the time. And I just have had conversations since we published this and throughout the entire 3-year journey of the Inclusion at Work series. And the number of pages related to this discussion have certainly decreased in annual reports since that article came out and continues to do so. One of the functions that may be an input to that output is the number of CIOs or inclusion officers or DEI chief officers, which have also gone down in recent years. They would be the individuals sitting on the board level that would decide or help to guide the annual report production and the thematics around it. The average tenure of the chief expert in this topic has typically been 1 to 2 years. And they have come from operations. This is a new practice in business. And when you have any new practice in any business, there's a lot of questions and a lot of churning. One of the big questions, should this topic be handled by the CHRO or the CEO? Do you need a CIO? Do you need that? Those debates have been relevant for the last 5 years especially, and the reason why we're seeing a reduction in the number of pages is all part of that, right? If I'm new to this stuff, and I've talked to these CIOs along the way they are engaged and they're charged with doing this, and all of us know this, if we're charged with doing something completely different that we've not done before, it takes us a year or two to really get into it, especially if you come from operations, right? Especially if you come from a different business unit, and many of them do. So I think that's a big input as to why. Are numbers getting better or worse in terms of inclusion? I don't have that head count because there are a lot of studies out there that are doing the head counts. And the answer, I'd say based on the different surveys that we get, both internal and external. And I think you understand that the answer to that is no, it's not getting better. But I do think there's the opportunity, again, as you're the Fed chair now, is you got to look at what's the interest rate to get it to be productive. That's what I think the real opportunity is.
Yeah, I'm going to go in I think I'm reading a bit of the mood in the room, at least with a lot of you, and I'm going to do some real talk. Not as
that wasn't real so far.
I'm going to get real.
Okay.
As the, I'm not speaking as the executive director of API Data. I'm speaking as someone who's a longtime observer and also someone who directed California 100. And so one of the things I would say is it was a pop-up think tank. It lasted for 2.5 years. We have a bunch of toolkits on scenarios and foresight. So go to california100.org/toolkits, and you'll see that. I think we're in a very challenging scenario. And part of the thing is to understand what are robust strategies that make sense regardless of the scenario. And then try to get yourself into a different scenario. That's going to take a while. I'm also a scholar of federalism and American politics and American political history. So after affirmative action got killed at the federal level in the context of admissions, there's been a very strong chilling effects. Corporations have been served notice, legal challenges. You've had entire states and their investment officers pushing back hard against ESG, in fact, penalizing companies that would do that. So I think that's part of what's going on, right?
And is inclusion in part of ESG or not? I'm not asking that's the rhetorical.
Correct. I mean,
rhetorical.
So I think it's the kind of the DEI agenda is under threat, even if you have certain states like California and its pension system trying to incentivize that, they're fair. And so most corporations, they do not want to get into political stuff. They're fundamentally risk averse. They do not want to get sued. They do not want to lose business. And so if they think about this cost compared to losing out on contracts with entire state governments, they will think long and hard about it. And they will be told, do not take that risk and play it safe. So given that context, I will go back to then what are the core values that we care about? And then how do we start adjusting our strategies given the scenario to do the work? By the way, we also know that this kind of work is ultimately best not only for society in terms of social impact, it's good business practice. Bringing people from different walks of life together and truly seeing what can happen, right, when you have a diversity of ideas and perspective. I think there's a helpful corrective here, which a lot of people, I would say maybe myself included, even though as an educator I tried hard not to do this, is to only think of diversity at a surface level. And I remember when I used to give talks about the work I do or about diversity, there'd always be some alum who came up afterwards like, what about perspective diversity? There aren't enough conservatives on this campus, right? And at the time I was like, I always knew that question was coming. But it is true, right? It is important for us to have perspective diversity. And it's not just Republican, Democrat. That's part of what diversity and inclusion work. That's how you really harness that power. So I think it's going to be challenging legally. There's a way, basically, if you take over DOJ, there are things you can use in this upside down world to basically say that thinking about race is racism. And there are going to be people not only with megaphones, but the authority of the federal government to enforce that. So I think it forces us to get back to fundamentals about what are we doing here and thinking about how our strategies need to change to do good work.
Repeat your question again, real quickly.
It was based on the outcome of the election that we saw on Tuesday. What does it mean for Asians at work? Are there any actionable insights we can all walk away from here today to react to that?
I thought I answered that question. Right?
Yeah, no, well, we have different perspectives in terms of what's actionable.
Yeah.
I do believe, first of all, I think this offers some productive ways of engaging in the conversation without bringing politics in. That was the perspective of this. This is not about politics. It can be, but this is about running a good business. And some of these action-based strategies will work in certain places and not work in others. So the idea that you invest in the community that you're in, like you donate $100 or $1,000 or $5,000 to the CBO, that is relevant to this discussion about what we represent as a company, that still runs true, because a lot of companies are not doing that. We say we care about this segment of our population because they're a big part of our revenue streams. Then let's do that locally so we can really get to know them. And I still think that's productive, actionable, and not about politics, right?
Yeah, and you still need to care about workforce. You still need to care about consumers.
Second thing that you bring about workforce is now it's a great time, if you're a business leader, to reinvestigate what your workforce is, to really dig down, because we get a lot of our cultural hints and understandings through industry. And to say that, therefore, we need, now, I'm not saying you do this extreme or that extreme. I'm saying just engage in the conversation of what is my workforce. That's it. We can't step away from it. We clearly can't. And the way we'll have, I think, better relationships at work is not to say, okay, we're going to let you be way over there and you over there. It's going to be a consistent move of, this is our DNA, this is what our workforce means to us, and let's rediscover what our workforce might be, because we're only going to get stronger and have higher productivity.
Let me do one final call to action from my side, which is we generate all this data. Look at our immigration data, right? So many of you are either immigrants yourself or the children of immigrants. So think about the kinds of water cooler conversations you need to have to educate your peers. But also think about writing letters to the editor and just doing your civic part so that we have an evidence base, but also conversation so that immigration is not just these images you see on TV of people sent in by the busloads and like overwhelming the public system in New York City. Like, you're part of an immigration story too, and like it is not being told. So I would say try to use your voice more. It's not just about the election. You have to use your voice after the election.
John, I know we're at the end of time here, I think is what you're saying. I would love, for those who need to go, please don't let us keep you. But if you can let 3 more people just give us their 15-second reaction or statement.
You're killing it.
That would, that's, if people come, I want them to be able to speak. Yeah. That's my point. So please, is there anybody else who has a statement or a question? Please go ahead and do that. I think you raised your hand.
Something I just want to clarify. Something I just want to clarify. You say this. You say in Bush administration, whatever percentage Asian American voted for Bush, and then you say 73% to Obama and 54% to Harris. I think I want to understand what is your point of view here, and I believe you say the driver is due to the way how Trump runs his administration, because more and more people see maybe the economy is getting better. So I trying to understand what has changed.
Okay, thank you, and he'll give a 1-sentence answer, and he's got a quick, and over here, and then we're done. I just want to get 3. If you're going to come here, I want to respect your time.
So I have like a 2-parter.
Oh, but make it fast, man.
Asian Americans in workforce.
Yeah.
I guess my experience has been we're kind of not. I feel like we're not included in the inclusivity conversation because of our model minority status. And the other part that I see is the confounding part too is like we're also have the glass ceiling, which is because we're seen as the outsider.
So we're not seen as white or as people of color.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the question is like, where do we go from here?
Got it. Okay,
the second part about elections I want to ask about is you talk about bucketing us as Asians versus smaller groups. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to get our voice heard. I mean, and at the end of the day, we also have to find a way to get our representation. I mean, is the way to enter politics and get into the fray to actually become a part of the conversation, because I feel like we're not targeted at all. So,
thank you. And one last one.
Yeah, I'm really curious on the portion you guys talked about for 2 seconds about Asians the AAPI community can be easily persuaded in the election. Not something I've heard before, and I'm just interested to hear that perspective. So yeah.
All right, Karthick, this is tough for you, but you got one sentence to answer all of these questions, the questions that were addressed in your space. Please, you can start with hers first.
Well, the data show that they're persuadable, right? And it's because Asian Americans did not grow up in a Democratic household or Republican household, because most Asian American voters are naturalized citizens. So that's where that persuadability comes in.
Meaning they switch more than other groups.
Well,
from one party to another.
They're a little bit more of a blank slate coming in. So the context in which they're coming in ends up being important. So that helps answer this question. Like, the Clinton administration did a lot to bring more newer Asian American voters coming in, seeing the Democratic Party as an economically moderate party, right? And as a party that was welcoming them. Post 9/11, Republican Party, with the rise of nativism and Christian nationalism, didn't feel like a welcome home for Asian Americans anymore. So that's the thing. So Asian Americans are more attuned to issues and also how the parties value them in whatever way. And the only thing about Trump is that no matter what, people can talk all they want about the fundamental nature of the economy. Like, was the economy under Obama's second term weak and horrible the way Trump said, or was it doing okay with room for improvement? Most economists would say it was doing okay with room for improvement. But what mattered was Trump's kind of perception machine, I'll just put it that way, right? Where the constant message over time and his ability to draw media attention in anything he does started making those perceptions an economic reality.
You have one sentence for his second part of his
Absolutely.
question.
I mean, we need to come, and that's why in our public opinion data, it's like what's amazing is that despite all of this diversity, right, socioeconomically, linguistically, religiously, there is such a thing as an Asian American agenda, and it's an inclusion agenda. That's fundamentally what it's about. Because he's about the inclusion at work. I just want to be like, back to that.
Absolutely. I wanted to react quickly in terms of persuadable. Persuadable because a lot like the stereotypes around the Midwest and the South being unaddressed is a lot like the AAPI voting bloc, or voters, I should say. Unaddressed, and once you're not addressed, you're saying, okay, who's going to talk to me? To your point about at work, engage. Go to be a volunteer at the veterans group. Be in the ERG. Be a volunteer for if there's a caregivers group. Go outside the spaces that you're in, because you're perceived as being only in the spaces that may not be the only spaces you are in. And that's why the perception at work, unfortunately, is fairly singular. And that is true in many, many places. Thank you all. Thank you, Karthick, and for staying late. I know we went a little bit longer.